Hi, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Gregory Q. Jenkins, and I'm the founder and CEO of Quintasia Studios, and this is the Quintasia Podcast. So we have a returning guest today. I wanted to talk about a specific issue that has been in the news as of late, and I immediately thought of today's guest and said I would like her to come back, and she graciously agreed. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the podcast, Adina. Welcome, Adina. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thank you so much for having me today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I wanted to, because as you know, we had some incidents. We had an incident of in New York City, which involved a gentleman who was experiencing homelessness, and that sparked all kinds of debate and talk in the news about that. So I once again want to, and just to level set, ladies and gentlemen, yes, we do mostly talk about entertainment on this podcast, but I also mentioned that I'd be talking about issues of social justice, because to me, the media and entertainment and issues of social justice are actually tied together. And you will see why in this podcast, as we talk about the influence that media and entertainment have on that particular issue of homelessness. So that's the first question I wanted to ask you is, do you think the media's portrayal of our neighbors experiencing homelessness helps or hinders society's progress in dealing with this issue?
I think that's a really great question. I think it depends what we say when we talk about media. There are so many different forms of media, right? There's movies, books, television, right? There's social media, there's news outlets. So there are so many different ways in which homelessness is, or in which media provides information. So it's a pretty big question. I think that there are certain places in which there has been an amazing portrayal of homelessness. For example, that classic movie, Pursuit of Happiness, or if anyone's recently seen the Netflix series Made, which is about a woman who is, cleaning homes and is a single mom, in an abusive relationship, who struggles with homelessness, and you see her going into various shelters, right? There are definitely instances which are really accurate portrayals of homelessness. But there's also a massive misconception around homelessness. And even in the way media and news outlets speak about homelessness is confusing for anyone who doesn't know much about homelessness, right? I'll give you a good example. There's a massive disconnect between people who are experiencing homelessness on the streets and who are living in shelters. Here in New York City, for example, 95% of people experiencing this are in shelters or in motels, but 5% are living on the streets. And that 5% is often what's portrayed in the media and what is spoken about. And those people need homes and care and love. But also there's this massive disconnect. And it was interesting. We saw like an article that was posted. Me and my husband were reading it recently about the whole concept around forcing longer hospitalizations for people who are suffering from mental health issues on the street, which we can go into that if you'd like. But anyways, that's what the article was talking about. And then there was someone who works in a shelter who, they asked for her comment. And, she was talking about how there aren't enough beds in New York City, right? But she was talking about a different issue than what what the article was about, right? And this article was talking about our neighbors who are on the street who aren't even opting to go into the shelters right now, and whether they should have forced hospitalizations. And so to me, there is just such misinformation, even from the people who are writing these articles. And I think when we talk about homelessness and in terms of, addressing issues around homelessness, there are so many different issues on so many different levels that I think even when we're talking about it, we need to be talking about shelter residents versus people who are living on the streets. Just that language alone makes a big difference in regards to media and articles and information that's being put out there.
And I think it also, that breakdown varies by location. Here in New York City, I believe the number you quoted was 95% live in shelters. But if we go to Los Angeles, that number is way different.
Yeah, it's about 5% in shelters there and 95%
right,
on the streets.
because they don't have, and as I explained the last time you were here. Now, I've never, just to clarify with everyone, I've never stayed in a shelter, but I did have to use the food pantry. And that's when it hit me, because you have certain expectations of who you're going to see. But the people who I saw who were in line with me, these people all had jobs. It's just that their jobs didn't pay enough for them to feed their families. So,
Exactly.
that was like the eye opener for me, because I'm expecting, to see the people who are, and a lot of these people that, I won't characterize a lot, but certainly some had jobs, but still couldn't afford an apartment.
Yeah. I mean, how many of us listening to this podcast have spent time in our life where we're living paycheck to paycheck, right?
Exactly. So I think that there's this huge, it varies by area, and it definitely, I think when we focus, and certainly that population does exist, the mentally ill, but I think we focus, because the conversations I was having within my own circle, the conversation was focused on those who are suffering from mental illness, but that's a I think it's fair that's a small population compared to the total population.
Sure.
And I think we need to take a broad lens when we look at this. It certainly is an issue. And, I can't speak I'm not familiar with what happened in other states, but I presume it's the same. In New York State, we closed down all of our mental hospitals. So,
Right.
you know,
And I love this topic because I don't love the topic because of how, it resulted, but the mental institutions were extremely abusive places, right? And there was a lot of slack that the government was getting for those institutions. So they were like, okay, great, save our government some money and let's get rid of all of them. But this is a population that needs care and that needs love. And anyone who says that someone who has such severe mental health issues that they're talking to themselves in the middle of the street and they are, sitting in their own feces, in their own unhygienic situations, right? A person like that needs to be taken care of.
exactly.
And that it's the same thing if you were to see someone who's bleeding out on the street. It's the same situation. These are people who need care. You would never say, a kid can go and live out on the street by themselves because they choose to. Someone who is suffering so severely with mental health issues, we cannot as a society say that's okay. Let's now all of a sudden let there be a choice. Now, that being said, we need to make sure that the places are safe.
Right.
And that there is no abuse happening. And right now, I don't know if there are places that are safe enough, for many of our neighbors on the street to go to. But definitely hospitals are a start, and they might not be the best places. And we need to constantly monitor and create better places. But to just look away, which is what our city and our country has done for too long, saying, all right, if they want to live on the streets, they should be able to make that decision on their own, is a really heartbreaking one. And it's interesting because not every person who's living on the street is suffering from those severe mental health issues, right? So there's also that fine line in between. And it's really complicated. And I definitely don't have the answers, but I definitely know from living in my neighborhood in New York City, I the other day saw a guy who was like yelling and singing and yelling, in the middle of the street. And the police officers came out. Now, first of all, this shouldn't be the police officer's job. We should have social workers and healthcare workers work on this. But anyways, we had police officers who I saw who came out who said, sir, you got to move it over 2 blocks. Because someone had called and said, we don't want it on our storefront. But this is a man who needs serious help right now.
Right.
And I think that there's a massive disconnect.
Yeah, and hopefully, and that's why I wanted to do shows like these is, hopefully we can help educate people, because it's really too many times we take the attitude that, well, somebody else will fix it. There is no one else who can fix it. This is our society. And if we think that this shouldn't be this way, it's not going to magically get better. We're not going to wake up one morning and this problem will be resolved. It's going to take work. And no one person like you, I don't have the answers. I don't know what to do. I understand the hospital's problem because I happen to know people who run hospitals. And I know that side of the story too. They get, you run out of bed space. You want to take care of everyone, but if someone comes in and they're a critical care patient and can't get a room because you have large numbers of homeless people, that's a problem too.
Right.
So I don't think hospitals are ultimately the right solution. We need to put them in a different kind of facilities to let people who need critical care go to hospitals, but still that takes will, because none of this happens for free. All of this costs money.
And I'm going to say something that might be too casual, and I don't know enough. I'm prefacing anyone who's listening. I am no expert on the case. But I've seen enough movies and heard of enough people who, when there are families that do have money and resources and great insurances, right? They're able to put their family members into safe group homes, into peaceful group homes. They exist. It's not this crazy idea, but for those who don't have family members who are able to care for them, right? For people who don't have guardians or people in their lives who can look out in a certain way, what happens to those people? And that's what we're talking about, right? Because there are amazing programs, and you've seen it. We've all seen movies where there's one that I saw recently. I'm forgetting the name now. But where there were beautiful lawns and fountains and recreational activities and nurses and doctors and families can come visit. And it didn't feel like a hospital room, right? This country is big enough, has massive enough spaces for us to be able. Now we just need the funding for it. But we have to create that incentivization.
Yes. And hopefully if people get better educated, and it's not a hopeless problem, it's just a problem that needs attention and some work.
And it's not a massive problem. The problem is massive, but the number of people who require this type of help, there are over 5,000 people who are on the streets of New York City on a given night. And there are probably about 200 to 500 people who need serious mental health attention. That need serious, like I've spoken to so many of our neighbors on this. They're wonderful and they're able to have very clear, coherent conversations. And then there's a number who are really struggling, and that create a sense of fear in New York City. People are scared of them. They're scared of people, right? They're not really able to fully communicate and articulate their needs. And like I said, it's not a massive number of people, but there is a need for it. And it's not a massive number, and we can create the solution.
And I think maybe getting that information out there that, hey, well, this isn't a massive number. This is something that's doable. We just have to advocate, that we do something about it. And hopefully, maybe as more people learn information about it, that will happen. So let me ask you, and this kind of, we've kind of touched upon it already, but what would you like the general public to understand most about our neighbors experiencing homelessness? What do you think? You think on average, people, the misperception that you would like to clear up?
Yeah. So what I would like most people to know is that our neighbors are experiencing homelessness are most often in LA and San Francisco. I'm taking you out of the equation for a little bit here, and we'll circle back there. But that the majority of people experiencing homelessness are actually not our neighbors who we see on the street. They're people that our kids are in school with, right? They're people who live in our neighborhoods that are living in shelters that are pretty well facaded that you wouldn't even know that it was a shelter, who are just trying to get stable housing because you can't stay in a shelter for over a certain amount of time. And they move you from shelter to shelter, but people who just need stable housing so they can get stable jobs, so they can have a stable place for their children and their families. Over 1/3 of people experiencing homelessness in New York City are kids under the age of 18, right? That is a massive number. And people, when we hear the word homeless, we think of the guy on the street corner with the cardboard signs, with the cans and the soda bottles. And those neighbors need our love and our care and our attention. But they also need to not be the poster child of homelessness. There is so much more. We have people who are coming out of the prison system and struggling to get jobs. We have moms who have kids who can't afford childcare. We have people who are working 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs, but that's not enough to cover rent in any of these major cities. So what I want people to know is whatever you think homelessness is, it's not. Whatever picture jumps into your head, it's not that.
And I would encourage people, and there's something, we might not have time today, but something I did want to talk to you about. So your organization, Knock Give a Sock, you have these dinners where you interact, and I like the term that you're about interactions with people who are experiencing homelessness. And I would invite everyone to get involved with that, because that's the road to understanding, is when you start communicating with people who are experiencing that problem, you begin to see, well, the first thing that's going to happen, if you're like me, you're going to go like, oh, wow, that could have happened to me. That could have easily been me. And for some people, I'm sure they'll say that was me for a little bit of time, because a lot of us have gone through severe disruptions in our life. And you may not have considered yourself, like when you were crashing on your friend's house, at your friend's house, because you didn't have a place to stay, you were homeless. And you might not make that connection that, you experienced that problem, and I'm sure because I've certainly been there, I'm sure there's a number of people out there, and if we just start changing our mindset and learn a little bit of empathy and compassion, I think we can do a lot better on this issue than we currently are. So hopefully, our conversations will do that. And that is a wonderful segue. I mentioned Knock Give a Sock. Can you please, we talked about it last time you were here, but good to have a refresher. Can you tell our audience a little bit about your organization and what you do?
Sure. So I run an organization called Knock Give a Sock, where our mission is to humanize homelessness 1 sock at a time. by turning transactions into interactions. And the transactions are these donations of socks, and the interactions are these meet your neighbor events. So I like to say the meat and potatoes of what we do is we engage corporate companies and local communities like churches, synagogues, companies like JP Morgan, Salesforce. We get these companies and communities to collect socks in their neighborhoods, in their offices. And after these communities or companies collect their socks, we then offer them a meet your neighbor dinner where we bring their employees, their community members, and recipients of these sock donations to have dinner side by side. And the reason why we do this is anyone who's listening, I like to ask this question too. I would say, raise your hand if you've ever given money, food, or clothing to someone in need. And almost everyone raises their hand. And then I say, who here can tell me the name of one person experiencing homelessness? And far fewer can raise their hands. And what I've seen is there's a massive disconnect between communities of people who care and want to give and want to help, but a massive disconnect with actually knowing people they're giving to, with who they're helping. And the only way we can create real social change, this is what I believe, the only way we can create real social change is by feeling personally connected to the people who are affected. Every social movement needs allies. If you think about the LGBTQ plus movement, if you think about the Black Lives Matter movement, allies are pivotal. We need them. And you walk into a room in corporate America and you say, who here knows the person of color? Who knows someone who's Black? Everyone knows somebody friends with, related to, married to. You ask, who here knows somebody who identifies as LGBTQ plus? Family members, friends, siblings themselves. I mean, in places of power, we are seeing allies and people who identify with those minority groups. But when it comes to homelessness, there isn't that connection. There's a massive disconnect because anyone who would fall into the category of homelessness, who is connected to those communities, for the most part, has resources. I love this. I ask this question all the time. I love speaking to affluent communities. I say, who here knows somebody with learning disabilities? They all raise their hand. I say, who here knows somebody who has mental health struggles? Everybody raise their hand. Who here knows somebody who's lost a job? Everybody raise their hand. I say, there's no difference between you and our neighbors experiencing homelessness. The numbers and the proportions of the community are the same. The difference is the resources. The difference is the safety nets. And without the safety nets, many of our neighbors end up in the shelter system.
So if it isn't apparent to my audience yet, you see why I had Adina come back to the podcast. Wonderful to talk to. I love your passion. I appreciate it. And it's people like you that will change the world because you dare to, fight our natural instinct to just say, well, no, I just want to keep over here. And we don't want to tackle anything difficult or uncomfortable or anything that might be hard work. But having that passion and realizing, no, this is something that we have to do. We need to be inspired by people like you. So hopefully the more people get to see you, the more people will, if anyone has a chance to, especially now you mentioned, so those of us who are lucky enough to be working, like if you have a company and they have any kind of philanthropic outreach and whatnot, I ask that you look into the possibility, one, having a sock donation drive, but two, and I think the two is even bigger than the one, see if your company will be willing to participate in Meet Your Neighbors. And that's what we need more of to happen. And that's what I want to talk to you about after this podcast. Because I want to see if my supporting job, it would be willing to host one.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And you should just know, and everyone listening, thank you so much, Greg, for having me. I can't even tell you, on the one hand, I've been doing this for 6 years. On the other hand, It doesn't get easier. Every year, it's like we survived COVID. I was able to stay on payroll and able to keep working, right? But now this, looming recession, or where companies are a lot more frugal right now, because just thank you. Thank you for reminding me of it's hard and it's uncomfortable and it doesn't get easier. And, reminding me, having this conversation, even I do this work day in, day out. And I like talking to somebody else about the why as a little flame under my tuchus, as us Jews
Well,
say.
well, definitely, we all go through the same thing. It's sort of like sometimes you feel like you're preaching in the wilderness by yourself.
Oh
But
yes.
but I can tell you, we're not always aware of how what we're doing is affecting other people. Sometimes we may never know because we may never have a chance to interact. But if the universe is kind, every now and then you run into somebody and they say, oh, I saw you do that, blah, blah, blah. I was so inspired. I went out and did this. And when that happens, you forget about every bad day you had. You forget about everyone who didn't listen, didn't pay attention, every newsletter that you sent out and nobody read. All of that you forget about because you remember that feeling that day, like, because of what I did, that inspired you to do something. That's wonderful. And even if it's one person, to me, it's worth it. So that's my philosophy.
I love that. Thank you.
Since our first interview, which is this dovetails into our conversation, now you mentioned the last time you were here that you were going to publish, I believe, 2 books, and you have since published those books. So I want to get an update on, how is it going? Can you remind people what those books were about? And what would you like to happen with those books in terms of, do you see anything like maybe, and I wish I could do it myself, but because we're a studio, so I'm always thinking, well, wouldn't that make a great movie? Or wouldn't that be, because this is how I think, and that's why I say media and entertainment is connected. If you have stories that you can put in visual form that gets the information out that you're trying to get out, that's powerful. But I'll shut up now.
I love that. I love that. I love the way your brain works. Yeah, so as I mentioned, right, Knock Knock Give a Sock's mission is to humanize homelessness one sock at a time by turning transactions, the giving of socks, into interactions, right? And to bring communities together, primarily to break stigmas around homelessness. So come the height of the pandemic, when we were last speaking, and we couldn't do the interactions. We couldn't do the meet your neighbor events. We couldn't do the programming where we're actually bringing communities together. And what I was seeing was actually awful in New York City. I was seeing petitions and like just community members rallying to get shelters that were moving into their area out of their area because shelters need to move into hotels. And I can't tell you how awful it was seeing families in well-to-do neighborhoods who weren't leaving their house during the pandemic, except maybe to go to the park, saying, our streets are dangerous now. We can't leave because shelters are moving in. I mean, it was awful. And there was no education around the shelter system, to the point where there were conversations about family shelters being moved around to move single adults there because, to displace families living in shelters to accommodate the wealthy, uptown family members and communities who were nervous about their neighborhood and having single adult men shelters in their area. Like, it was ridiculous. And I was like, how do we teach these families about homelessness in meaningful ways? And that's when the Pair of Books project came to me. So here I have a picture of the Pair of Books Project. The Pair of Books Project is actually a set of books. And the set of books, one is called Knock Knock, Give a Sock. And the other is called Knock Knock, Where's My Sock? And I was inspired to write these books when families in various parts of New York City were struggling with grappling with the concept that their neighbors experiencing homelessness were going to actually be their next door neighbors in some of the hotels and buildings. And I figured this was a great way to educate communities. So the first book, and the books come as a set, the first book is called Knock Knock, Give a Sock, and it's about a little girl named Dee Dee who starts collecting socks for her neighbors on the street. And not only does she collect socks for her neighbors on the street, but every person she gives out a pair of socks to ends up sharing their story, right? So we have, and their stories in ways in which kids can understand. So one was a man who got hurt on a construction site. The other was about a man who grew up not having parents. So now that he was becoming an adult, he didn't know where to go. One person who had a parent who was sick, and they didn't want their parent knowing that they were struggling on their own, right? And these are the different stories that we tell to little kids in ways that they can absorb and understand. So their neighbors on the street become seen as their neighbors. We never use the word homeless once in the entire book. And it comes with a companion book called Knock Knock, Where's My Sock? Now, Knock Knock, Where's My Sock is about a little girl whose family has to move into the shelter. And during her move to the shelter, she loses the matching pair to her lucky sock. And she thinks, what could I do with just one sock? And first she tries it on as a bag, but it's too small for her toys. Then she tries it as a bracelet, but it's too big. Eventually she puts it over her face and cuts 2 holes for the eyes and turns it into a superhero mask. And she ends up starting a superhero club in the shelter with all the other kids, and they do random acts of kindness throughout the city, and they get recognized by the city for all the work that they do. And the idea is, in both books, you have 2 girls in 2 different housing situations who both make an impact in their neighborhood, regardless of their housing status. And through this, we're able to teach kids about our neighbors on the street through one book, and about the shelter system through another. And that's how Knock Knock, Give a Sock is able to break the stigma around homelessness through these 2 stories, right? We see it, we learn about our neighbors on the street, we learn about our neighbors in the shelter, and most importantly, we teach kids about how to make an impact. And my favorite thing about these books is that actually the book about a little girl living in a shelter is the more popular book amongst kids living in homes and in shelters. And it is actually the only children's book on homelessness in which there's a kid living in the shelter system, and they're a hero in the story. I've ordered every single children's book on homelessness, and many look like this book, the Knock Knock, Give a Sock book about someone helping their neighbors on the street. And this one focuses actually way more on our neighbors and what their stories are. But this book, the book on Knock Knock, Where's My Sock? It's the only book in which a kid living in a shelter is actually the protagonist and tells their powerful story. And all the other children's books I've read on the shelter system are these sad stories where it's about a mom and a daughter living in a car and she has to figure out how to cheer her mom up, or a dad and a son living in an airport and how the boy's really sad, and another one on how a mom and a kid pretend the shelter is a rocket ship, right? But none are really about these kids who are just like kids. The shelter is their drop off, the background and how they can make an impact.
Well, to me, we're all about stories here and storytelling. I think, and that's what I'm trying to do. Is I understand how, and I'll try to express my thought here as to how we got to where we are in terms of why certain films get financed and why certain films don't. It just becomes, and I think what one executive said to me once, it explains the mentality: wash, rinse, and repeat. when you're talking about financing, I want Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, something man, something woman, something. And I understand that. I don't have to think about it. I just want, give me something different, but the same. That's another
Right.
phrase you will hear in Hollywood. um, and it makes it harder for, it's not that there isn't a demand for, stories of the heart to break through, but anyway, I want to find a way to be able to finance films like that. Just like, hey, and I like my tentpole movies too. I like, Marvel, DC, sorry, DC, to a lesser extent, but I like Marvel. But, a star, especially, where is my sock? That to me, that just sounds like a wonderful story. And I think that it would inspire. Imagine if someone who a person who was living in a shelter happened to see that, somehow
Mhm.
were able to see that.
Yeah.
So many of us, that's what has happened. On the unexpected things that has happened when I started this podcast is you go through things in life and you kind of get this tunnel vision and you think you're the only person going through it. But the advantage of being willing to share your story is that you then learn that, oh, wow, people have a similar story to your own.
Yeah.
It's that common humanity. And we have to fight against, the darkness that's out there,
Hmm.
against people who want to do the opposite,
Right.
who want to exclude people, who want to not talk to people or things like that. I think our world is better when we can show compassion and we genuinely care about those who are around us, what they're experiencing. Because you find that in helping others, you help yourself. The two are connected. It's not like a separate thing. As anyone who's done any kind of volunteer work will tell you, that they benefited from that volunteering, and that it helped enhance their life. Well, this is, as always, this has been an unbelievably great conversation, and I thank you for taking the time to stop by once again. Like I said the last time, and it wasn't just words. Sometimes, we've gotten a lot busier since the last time I saw you.
Good.
But yes, that is a good thing. But I am sincere, and like with all the guests that I have, we're about community here. So it's not just you come on the podcast and then we want to keep in touch. We certainly want to hear your efforts and how things are doing, and be encouraged. Uh, you know, be that good warrior as you have been. Love your spirit. We need more of that in this world. That is for sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. And honestly, like I said before, some days are harder than others, and the why is the most important thing. So thank you for coming on and letting me have a platform to talk about the why. It'll make my grants for the rest of the week have a lot more fire behind them.
Well, certainly happy to do so. And ladies and gentlemen, you have been listening to the Quintasia podcast, and our guest today has been Adina, and so enjoyed this conversation. I invite you, if you didn't see the first time that we had a conversation with Adina, that you go look, in addition to this one, look that up too, and you'll be doubly inspired. So thank you again. I wanted to say I am Gregory Q. Jenkins, and bye-bye for now, and I will see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.